No, thank you very much. That might be too hard. Okay, this year I'm doing white Cattleyas from the species up through probably the early 80s, because what most people in orchids don't know is that white flowers for any plant have always been the most coveted, and certainly orchids. In the middle height of the Depression, in 1939, Thomas Young of Bound Brook, New Jersey, who had the largest cut flower business in the United States, sold, it was the front page of Forbes magazine, his business for $2.9 million and retired to England in 1939 when money was tight, and it was all over orchids. A white Cattleya in Madison Avenue in the war years was going for as high as $25 retail. So and that was real dollars for one flower. So there were orchid people who truly made their fortunes, vast fortunes in the cut flower business. And of course, nothing was greater sought than white. So all of the collectors in the late 1900s and early 20th century certainly were looking for something special in white flowers. And my favorite story before I start this was Monsieur Firmin Lambeau, the famous Belgian collector, for whom Gigas Firmin Lambeau are, for you judges who like to call it Varsovitzi, which I refuse. When he had to leave in World War I, when the invasion started, he took a picture of his mother, a suitcase, his rosary, and one plant. And it was Gigas Firmin Lambeau with him. So that just is a little preamble to why white flowers. So I'm going to start with the most famous of the species. Some of them were my picks because they're my favorites, some because you've never seen them before, and other reason because they were significantly important in breeding white flowers. Nothing, and I underline 10 times, is more important in white flower Cattleyas than this one particular flower. Triania broom hills. It doesn't have the greatest form or shape, but all one has to know, if you could trace the gene pool in white Cattleyas today, countless numbers would have this in its background. Harold Patterson, I have his entire stud book and cross book, used it 946 times. It was used over and over and over again because of the fact that it bred white. It also produced a large number of flowers. Not the best Triania for sure, but it is the most significantly important white Triania. Second would be lindens. It produces smaller flowers and they're not as erect, but this was the benchmark for sure. This is, if the war came and I took my suitcase and a picture of my mother with me, this would be the one plant I would take with me. It is because I am the only person to my knowledge who still has it. It's the most famous Mossiae of all times and the greatest shape, jungle collected. It won its AMRHS in 1911, Mossiae Queen Mary. My godfather, Alfred Prebstel, bought that from the Dixons in 1942 when they were in the midst of their divorce. And I don't know of no one else that still has it other than myself, and I've given peace to Longwood Gardens. But for a Mossiae, it was spectacular. It doesn't have floppy petals. It's a great shape, and it bred white. And it was used in England numerous times, and John Lager of Lager and Harrell bred with it. Harold Patterson, and probably the biggest breeder of all were the Dixons in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania. But it's truly a magnificent breeding flower. And this is the other one. The benchmark for Mossiae is Cattleya Superba FCC RHS 1865, not 1965, 1865. My big mother plant of that had 33 flowers on it when it bloomed this year. It was used countless times for the same reason. It bred white, more typical of the Mossiae shape, but it was used by many people, and the most important one, I suppose, would have been the Bound Brook, New Jersey folks because they used it to produce white flowers. My other, maybe I'd have to have 2 plants beside my suitcase. This is another treasure of mine that I've had since I was a little boy that also came out of the Dixon collection, actually originally from the Cooley collection in Pittsfield, Massachusetts at the turn of the last century. Labhyate, Alba, Harefield Hall, the famous white breeder. There's lots of great ones, but this one was the benchmark that was used over and over and over again. Art Chadwick Sr. has written practically the best dissertation on this plant that I know of because it consistently bred white. Well, there'd be 3, I'm sorry. And I did this particularly for Bill Rogerson this time because I promised him and promised him. It took me 30 years to find this plant, the real one, not the fake one. And I cut him off his back bulbs, and he better be glad he showed up. Because this is the most famous thing that
Hallelujah!
Yeah. This is the most famous white breeder. John Lager Sr., John Emil Lager, had this on his letterhead at the turn of the last century. It was one of the few flowers that he said it was picked by God and put on a tree, and he happened to be in Colombia when it was found in an area that they never discovered again. I should have put the tape measure because I'm always being accused of not measuring correctly or being Texas exaggerated. But this is this year's blooming of the famous Schroederi Alba, the real one that used to be called Sumentensis that was changed to Hercules. And it was 8 7/8 inches across. And it is truly a spectacular thing. And as I said, Lager and Harrell used it in black and white on their letterhead as his favorite flower that was ever discovered, and it breeds white. And you may ask, well, why wasn't it used so many times? Well, let me tell you, the plant was so treasured once it won its little award. It was in 3 people's hands for about 40 years. And the way this plant still exists today and how I eventually got it was Mrs. William K. DuPont had given a piece to Emperor Hirohito in Japan. And it was in the Japanese Imperial Collection and has been there throughout all the wars. And through a Japanese friend of mine who's one of these 90-year-old orchid growers, I convinced him that I couldn't live without it. And so I got 3 little bulbs that come with no roots. And I've nursed and nursed and nursed, and every year it gets bigger. And finally, Bill Rogerson gets his dream, and he's going to owe me forever. And then, maybe 4, I take it back. This was my best blooming ever, and I've had this plant for years. This is Mendelii Alba Stuart Lowe, the absolutely pristine white, won its FCC with RHS in 1910. The flowers are enormous for Mendelii, and it is truly a spectacular flower and used in breeding as well. And a lot of people ask, why were some of these things not used or in cultivation? People held on to these plants. In those days, these were plants owned by extremely wealthy people who were highly competitive, and they certainly were not into sharing.
They were prestige.
They were prestige plants, absolutely. And this poor little thing, and Brian, wake up. This is the original. This is the famous one, Lodigicii Alba Stanleys, that Ernest Hetherington. And by the way, for all of you who've heard rumors that Ernest is dying and not doing good, he had a terrible bout of the flu. He was on the phone with me 2 weeks ago. Pam put him on the phone, and we talked, and he has new hearing aids, and he said he's not ready to die, and he's doing just fine. So anyway, Lodigicii Alba has a tremendous history in breeding in this country because the smaller Cattleyas, the Japhet, we used to call Japhet orchids, smaller ones, have this as a parent. And this is the original plant that I got from Frank Fordyce many years ago that came from Herbert and Rita Carruthers' collection, but it produced the smaller flowers. And obviously there's many great, much better loaded GCIs today, but this is the original one.
Better Harrisoniana too.
Very right, exactly. And this one, not as many people know about. This is one of my coveted things, O'Brieniana Alba, Rivermont. It also was used, it was Clint McDade's stud plant. He actually kind of changed the name because this was Dixon originally, and when he bought a portion of their collection in the middle of the divorce in the 40s.
Jeff,
Uh-huh.
that was used a lot, right?
A lot.
Was that what was used to make Little Angel?
Little Angel, yes.
It was that one.
That very one. But it's originally was the Dixon's variety, but when Clint McDade of Rivermont Orchids bought a large portion of the Dixon collection, he changed it to Rivermont. But it has also been used to produce smaller white Cattleyas. And then there is the elusive, and if I got to resurrect a few years ago an orchid, this would be it. Probably the most talked about white Cattleya ever, because it went down truly by a, what do you call it, the underground missile? What do you call those things?
Submarine?
Submarine, yeah. Was shot during the war. Many of the great English collectors sent their collections to the United States to be babysat because they couldn't either afford the coal to heat the greenhouses, or they were, or couldn't get it other than Vacheron and Lecouf. They managed to do it, but they also were afraid of bombing. And this plant is historic in so many ways because it went down to the bottom of the deep blue sea, and it is never, so anybody that says they have this, they're a big liar. But anyway, there's a whole bunch written about it. And Suzanne High, Alba, Gaskeliana by Mossii, registered in 1906, is the backbone of most every important white Cattleya today because it is one of the two parents of Bobels, and Bobels is the parent of everything known to man. But this is what Suzanne High Alba looked like before it went to orchid heaven in the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. And this is another one of my great treasures, Edithii Alba White Empress, which is Suzanne High by Trianii, and I should have put it down there, Broom Hills, by Powell's, registered in 1914. This is the other great breeder prior to World War II, also one of the parents of Bobels, obviously back-crossed with Suzanne High. The problem with white Cattleyas prior to Bobels were most of them did not have great substance. They did not last very long. They produced slender stems. They were floppy. And for people who were spending $25 for a flower in 1939 in Manhattan, I guess they expected more. But this cross that you will begin to see changed white Cattleya breeding forever between Edithii Alba White Empress and Suzanne High Alba, created, one more before I do that. This is another very, very famous breeder plant, Calwianii Prebstel's variety, intertexta by Mossii, that McBean registered in 1915. And I believe, if Bob Scully's memory serves, will remember, I think Calwianii, even Jones and Scully used late in breeding. Did you not?
I don't think we had it.
Oh, okay.
I know your godfather and my dad were tight, but I don't think we ever talked about that.
Okay. It's a very, very famous breeder that bred white as well. Now, here we go to the Mecca. If there was ever a private collector in the United States of America or England who was more possessed with white flowers, I don't know it. Ernest Blaney Dane, Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts. He was married to Helen Pratt, the heiress to the Standard Oil of New Jersey fortune. Money was unlimited, 16 greenhouses. His competition was A.C. Burridge, who lived on the other side of the hill, who had 19 greenhouses. He did not have one colored flower, not one. He had greenhouses of white odontoglossums. He had greenhouses of white everything. But his love, of course, was white Cattleyas. My favorite story was the great Boston flower shows before there were orchid shows were so highly competitive. All the great growers in the 20s would show up and have these massive exhibits, to the extent that even A.C. Burridge took the roof off of Horticultural Hall to the tune of $50,000 in 1921 to bring in life-size palm trees and set up a moat with water and swans. And the famous...
He sent his people down to
Florida to get the
30 days before
to dig up all the trees. Right. And he decided he wanted to have swans in his huge exhibit, which was a little over 8,000 square feet. And with bridges and moats and the whole 9 yards. And his next door across the road neighbor, Ernest Blaney Dane, had this incredible display of white odontoglossums. And in those days, that was the crispums with these glorious streamers. I have black and white pictures. And guess what? They hung over on A.C. Burridge's moat side with the water. And guess, over in the middle of the night, it was, the Boston Globe even records it. The doors opened the next morning, and all of the tips of all the white odontoglossums were gone. A culprit had come and cut them. No, it was A.C. Burridge's swans who ate them. So that was recorded in the newsprint that his best friend and competitor swans ate his odontoglossums. But Mr. Dane was determined to have the best collection, and probably for his time period did. And he named this one after his wife, Helen Pratt Dane. It's Barbara Dane, which is also his mother, by Edith I. Alba, White Empress. And this was 1941. And for 1941 and its time period, it's an incredibly great flower. I looked for a long time for this plant. I didn't know if it still existed. My godfather never had it. It was so tightly held. But I convinced Longwood they needed something I had, and I needed something they had, and we traded. But interestingly enough, even though this is a pre-Bobel's plant, the shape is excellent. It has great texture, and it was very famous. You ask why these flower plants were not in circulation. This was a private collection. They did not need the money. They did not care about anything except their own little world. And if he did not give something to some of his friends, that's the only way it would have ever come out.
And they didn't want anybody.
They didn't want, and every FYI, in those days, every time the flowers were shown, all of the pollen was removed out of all of the flowers. Because pollen, the most expensive documented pollen, was $750 for one pollen capsule of one plant, which he wanted forever, Schroederi Alba Hercules, and that was in 1930, $750. Now, another famous Dane plant. This one lost the man his job. Ernest J. Hannington was one of 4 growers, but he was the head grower for Ernest Blaney Dane at Chestnut Hill. And the rule of thumb in those days, your grower asked permission of the master of the household before you named something and registered something. This was the most important flower to come out of the Dane collection, bar none. It has been argued by AOS judges for decades that it was the same as Bobel's, and it is absolutely not. All you have to do is go to Harvard and look in the record books of the Blaine collection, and you will see the original plants. But Mr. Hannington, instead of asking Mr. Dane, his boss, what they were going to name it, he went on and named it and registered it after his daughter, the grower, and he was fired as soon as it was found. And Ernest Hannington never found an orchid job in America again. The flower set precedent It was registered the same year as the other celebrity white Cattleya Bobels, both at the end of the war. Not as certainly highly obtainable because it was in a private collection, but nevertheless, it won its FCC first time it was shown, and it is to this day a beautiful thing. And there's various cultivars. This is the FCC version, and for those of you who haven't been orchids in long enough, many of them had no cultivar names. They just had the award. So it had, this is just Joyce Hannington FCC. Now, I believe you'll never see this picture except because I was so fortunate. Clint McDade's granddaughter gave me all of their archives from Rivermont, and I was thrilled when I opened this one book because this is the very first seedling blooming of Cattleya Bobels that was ever taken in England for Black and Flory Nursery, of which Clint McDade Rivermont ended up buying. This changed the face of white Cattleyas forever. Of course, it's Edith the Eye, Alba, White Empress by Suzanne, who went to the bottom of the ocean. And it was registered the same year as Joyce Hannington, and it produced a bevy of seedlings that were so consistently beautiful, form, shape, and this is the backbone of every white Cattleya today. And I don't know, I don't like to make statements I can't prove, but all one has to do is go look at the number of awards, and I don't think other than Phalaenopsis doris, any single plant received as many awards as Bobels does. Perhaps now, but for the longest it was Phalaenopsis doris and Bobels. But that's the very first seedling that bloomed. Now, everybody's going to start raising their hands on this one because I put the two things that I think are the most beautiful, and there's gazillions of them, and I'll tell you why. The finest, the first awarded Bobels ever, which I still own, Bobels Purity FCC AOS in 1945, is hands down, bar none. Not only is it the first awarded cultivar, it is, in my opinion, the finest of the cultivars. It produces the flattest flowers, incredible substance, they last forever, and I've never had a bad blooming on it. And that is the very first one awarded. Then the one that everybody knows, because everybody has that one and not this one, is Snowflake. It was awarded a few years later in 1949. But I want to go back, and I should have put them side by side, just to compare. Even though it's a fine flower, look at that. Look at the fullness. I don't think there's any question that Purity is far superior to the famous Snowflake. Agreed?
Just a photography.
What?
It's just a photography.
Okay. Smart ass. Then the elusive. There are a few of these still running around. And the reason I didn't expand that picture. This is the very first orchid ever cloned. Ever. And long before Vacheron and Lecouf. Everest McDade, one of the sons of Clint McDade at Rivermont, which the family ended up in a 10-year lawsuit over, this was his choice to clone. And Bobels Honolulu has been used over and over and over in breeding. And once again, this flower, I think, although never awarded, is by far better than Snowflake.
Yeah, you think that any one of these grows better than another?
No question about purity. Maurice Lecouf told me many, many, many years ago that he used to use, what did the French call, what's the French word for steroids? I have to think about it a minute. But he said purity was like a flower on steroids, because every year that plant, I have divided it many, many, many times and given many, many pieces of it away. It grows, instead of in a straight line, it grows to the left, it grows to the right, and it grows, and you'll have 3 inflorescences at one time. That's the big difference for me. You know, you'll have lots of flowers, and it's just a much better plant. I don't know, in those days when everybody was doing chromosome counts, I'm not sure if Alfred ever counted it, but it's got to be a tetraploid. It's just got to be. Oh, do they breed? Yes. Yes. Purity was used. Fergie Beale at Beale's Nursery, Vashon Island, Washington, used it over and over and over and over.
Most of the boat bales were triple.
Were they?
Yeah.
Well, that would answer why.
That's why they didn't breed.
Purity was used over and over and over.
There were tetraploids in that.
And then we go back just a little bit, digress, because I showed you the picture of the original Lodogesii stanleyi. This changed white Cattleyas also for American cut flower market. Henrietta Japhet, also a Houston woman, Lyons variety is Eucharist by Lodogesii stanleyi, which Clint McDade also did in 1946. Florists were looking for smaller white Cattleyas rather than these giant Eleanor Roosevelt types that they covered their whole their shoulders. And there were 2 that came out that became world famous. And actually, I used this one first because in the florist industry, you would go into a florist and you would say, I want a Japhet. That didn't mean this particular plant. That meant a flower that was about this big around. A type. And it became a type. And this set precedent and made a gazillion dollars for Clint McDade. And the other one was Louise Georgiana. And that is Intermedia by Souvenir de Louis Sanders. Ralph Kieswatter did this. This was another one popular on the eastern seaboard. Wedding bouquets, particularly corsages, that they didn't want to be overwhelming. So these 2 flowers, Henrietta Japhet and Louise Georgiana, were marketed like you cannot believe. They were everywhere. And unfortunately, poor Ralph Kieswetter didn't get to name his type. It stuck, as a Japhet orchid.
I think you go into florists today.
And you still can call it, I want a Japhet. Now, my friends, since I was a little bitty boy, who I still see every year, who have the oldest orchid establishment in the world that's still in existence, Vacheron and Lecouf, have been famous for many, many things. But I think if you really had to stop and pick one of all of their celebrated crosses, you would have to stop with this, because Brassocattleyas were changed forever by this one plant. Deas, which is Furrier by Lamartine, which Vacheron and Lecouf registered in '47, was a huge breakthrough in Brassocatleya breeding and whites. Now, you're going to ask, there's 2 things, or you should ask 2 things about this particular plant, this cross. It has a time warp to it, and I call it a time warp because it passes on a genetic trait which one year will take presence and the next year it will not. Any of you who are familiar with Pastoral Innocence, which you'll see in a minute, and a couple of more cultivars, sometimes you'll see the flower with the little purple in the lip, and sometimes you won't. It comes from this plant. Furrier, the mother of this, did the same thing, and it's been passed on over and over and over. Of all of the Deases, this is my favorite because of its production of flowers and the lip. I mean, give me a break. Why would you not call that French lace? It's just an amazing, amazing plant. But there was a breakthrough in this particular cross. And the breakthrough came with Fergie Bill from Vashon Island, Washington, Bill's greenhouse. Every single plant, Mount Hood, Mount Anderson, Mount anything that has Deas as a parent, only use this particular cultivar, Rainier. And it's an interesting story because Fergie Bill bought from Maurice a flask of seedlings, unnamed, of the cross Deas. And of course, there's every mountain, McKinley, all of those in his part of the world. And this was the best of the best. And he named it Rainier. And it was not until the, what was it, Fourth World Orchid Congress in Long Beach, which one was that? Fifth, that plant ever got out of Vashon Island, Washington, because Fergie would not part with it. It has the best shape of all, and its genetics have been passed down to so many things. Such a round flower. Never awarded, never shown.
Was that a tetraploid?
You know, I don't know if that one was ever counted or not.
Probably was.
But it was very special, and Maurice coveted it, and it took him forever to get back his own plant. Then the second big breakthrough, and this is a huge controversy because of the parentage, and I'm not even going to go there because I'm tired of arguing about it for 40 years. Bob Metz, which also Clint McDade at Rivermont did. And I will tell you this, we know for a fact that it was Bobel's Honolulu was the mother plant. The Mossy Eye, let's just not go there, let's just say it was Mossy Eye. And there were 50 million of these awarded, but I picked not Sestina, the Virgin, which is a Sib cross. I picked what I believe to be the most pure, perfect flower of all of the Bob Metz's, and that's Lion's variety. Only an AM, it blooms consistently good. I've never had a bad blooming. It's a very round flower, and it produces lots of them, and it's not the FCC ones. Sestina, which is the FCC one, which is, Fred Misbaugh told me one time, or maybe it's Keith Davis, that's the one plant you can find in your greenhouse because it's a squatty little thing compared to the rest of them. But I've never understood what was so special about it. This is a Ward photo, and I thought, well, I think this is a lot prettier. But anyway, Bob Metz was so famous, and it was, of course, a Bobel's hybrid. And then, what I love, General Patton. I don't know if any of you know the story on this. Clint McDade at Rivermont wanted to rename a plant, Cattleya Stalin, to General Patton. RHS wouldn't do it, so I had to make a new cross. Bobel's Honolulu by Barbara Billingsley, #1, which is actually Harold Patterson's plant. McDade, 1952. It's an incredibly good bloomer, very erect flowers, and I love the reason he called it General Patton, because it has a stem as fat as my little finger, and the flowers just stand up perfect. Another great white Cattleya. Another one that has still been used over and over and over, Bet Diane, the favorite cultivar. Bob Metz by, once again, look, even in 1956, they were using Estelle Alba Cynosure, which is a direct hybrid from Edithii Alba. All of these white flowers basically can be traced back to the descendants of Edithii Alba White Empress and certainly Trianii Broom Hills. This one has been popularized. Many people still have this in their collection. And Walter Off's father. Wow. This is a fabulous flower and fragrant, fragrant. Nancy Off Linwood. BB White by Joyce Hannington, 1956. I'm doing these in chronological order just to show you what breeding was like. A wonderful flower. Now, we have to stop here because I think when this particular cross was made, it has due reverence. Frank Smith will tell you to this day, if you had to pick one white flower to breed with, this would be it. It's an unusual plant. Lucille Small Marshall, Earl J. Small, which Ken worked for. I've never known which Bobel's cultivar would have been the parent.
It was mine.
It was?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I won it in a raffle when Black came to the United States.
When Peter Black came?
Yeah, and I traded a piece to Earl Small.
So now I can add that it is Ken Roberts' plant. And Dorothy McHale, which is Harold Patterson's cross, he named after all of his mistresses and girlfriends, and that was one of them. But this plant is so small, it produces a little bitty short plant that's squatty, and it has these enormous, perfectly round flowers. Even just recently, I know that both David Off and Frank Smith have made crosses using this plant, and I think it really is one of the spectacular things in more recent times. Great flower count.
But it wasn't used very much.
No, and it wasn't.
And probably the reason is it's not a great grower.
No, it isn't, unless you get it in a pot and you don't touch it and you leave it alone for about 10 years and it gets huge. And, but the flowers are beautiful. Okay, this one I put in because somebody asked me to put it in. It would not be one of my picks. B.O. Bracey made this and named it after Mr. PG Barnett's wife. It got an FCC. I don't know which Bob Metz was used because Bracey's stud book, when he closed his nursery and he had Alzheimer's, they don't know what happened to it. But anyway, it's Arctic Circle by Bob Metz. For some people, this particular cross was considered to be such a fine thing. I've bloomed it I've bloomed it for 20-something years. I don't like the way the flower petals curl. It's certainly not flat. I think the judges were on drugs that day. Angel Bells Suzie. Oh my. What an interesting flower. It's not a big flower. Terrific bloomer. Also Clint McDade, Rivermont. Empress Bells by Little Angel. It is one of my favorite smaller flowers, consistent. If you had to have a white flower that you wanted to have lots of flowers on in your greenhouse, Angel Bells Suzie is one to have.
Angel Bells, do you see it crippled in heat? I mean, that's something I've noticed with mine. It blooms twice a year.
I don't know if I've ever noticed that actually.
The problem is it's been cloned on clones. So
Right.
there are all kinds of, there are not all kinds, but high frequency clone mutants as a result of the multiple cloning.
I'm sure that's true. Now, for me, if I had to pick of the more modern things, someone at breakfast was talking about antique or old magazines in 1970, and I thought, old. Well, maybe this one's old for you, but this isn't old for me. This is one of my all-time picks. It blooms consistently. Earl Imperialis, and it deserved the FCC. Empress Bells by General Patton. Incredibly beautiful round flower, great shape, never fails to bloom beautifully. This is one of my top, more recent picks. 1961, more recent. Okay, here we go. Pastoral Innocence. Madame Louise Powell's by Diaz French Lace, Rolf Altenburg. I couldn't believe how many people didn't know that Rolf Altenburg made this cross in 1961. Everybody's always shocked. Okay, this is where Diaz comes in and out. Sometimes it blooms without the little purple tip in the lip, and sometimes it does. And that always comes from Diaz French Lace, always. And here's another one. Mount Hood Mary. Once again, Fergie Beale. This was Bobel's Prebstel's variety, which took me ever to find my godparents' plant again, but I know for a fact that Jones and Scully must have used it a lot because it's always in their imperial catalog, Prebstel's variety Bobels. But Mountain Hood Mary, the white version, which was Diaz Rainier by Bobels Prebstels, 1962, another big Brasso Cattleya. And another thing from Jones and Scully. They didn't register it, but they had it and awarded it. Tiffin Bell's Orchid Glade. White Blossom by Bobels, Dingleman, 1962. Another one of those great white flowers that always blooms beautifully. Incredible substance. Okay, here we go with controversy years. When I say past 1960, it starts to get tenuous. Ranger 6 AOK, Noguchi by Empress Bells, Armor Cross, 1964. Well, this is the slide picture that Ernest gave me a long time ago. And I said, I want to find the photographer and the plant and the person who did mock-up on the slide, because I have probably 20 or 30 different Ranger 6s, and I've never had one where that lip expands out that yellow as this photograph does, but supposedly it does. Maybe I'm just not a good grower of Ranger 6, so I don't give it enough care. But this made a big, huge push in the 60s because of the great lip.
Wasn't that a big winner at the conference?
It was. It was.
So probably there's a record you could find there if you're looking for the original one.
Well, this is the earliest slide I know, and this is the slide that is not the same as the one in Armor Cross catalog, but I've just never seen one where the yellow, I mean, Fred, you've had it forever. Has yours ever bloomed a lip out that came all the way to the edge like that? I've never seen that. Anybody else have Ranger 6? Have you ever seen the lip go out that far?
No.
Well, this has always been a big question for me. It probably is. It is. Another unknown one by many standards, but absolutely stunning flower. And now all these people want all these things. I get emails and phone calls from people I don't even know that I can't even speak their language looking for this particular flower. And I don't understand why. It must be real popular in Japan right now, because this is Harold Patterson's famous Helen P. Dane, which I showed you earlier, the FCC version by Barbara Billingsley, and that should be number 1. Incredibly large flowers. I remember one year when at the New York show, right when they moved to the ice rink, and Fred and I were there. Remember in that tent, that big, Joe Silva had that plant that was probably 30 flowers. This is Athena Chagaris, once again another mistress of Harold Patterson. Another great breakthrough breeder for sure, Old Whitey Mount Empress. Mount Rainier, Empress Bells, Armor Cross. Ernest used it 1,000,000 times in breeding white flowers. It has incredible fragrance. I don't think the best shape, but it's very popular breeder for white. Now, I have to thank Fred Misbah for this, because he told me about this plant, and I would never have known about it. And if I had to pick of modern things, modern for me, this is my all-time favorite in my entire collection, and I'm not big on taking plants to get award, but I did take this one, and we had everything from 93 to 88. Of course, I didn't get the 90s, but anyway, it didn't matter. This plant, Frank Fordyce made when he was working for Rod McClellan. Tiffin Bells by Barbara Billingsley. And this flower, I have never on any plant. And if you see that big giant head, that is one inflorescence. It's just like a cabbage. I saw this, or Fred saw it at Frank's greenhouse first, and you told me about that. And you saw one that Bob Fuchs had, just a cut flower of, at some show out of the country, and you were amazed. The flowers are like wax. They are so perfectly shaped and formed. The only problem, they have two, they're huge and they don't have enough space sometimes. But it is an amazing flower. And I have to tell you the story. When I took this thing to be judged, they said, oh, this must be a remake. Because all the judges were 1971, never been awarded, but it was 1971. And it was carte blanche, and it was really one of my favorite things.
Jeff? Do you notice how many times you put Barbara Billingsley up there?
Uh-huh. A lot.
A lot.
Okay, the other big breakthrough, but we're going to have a big argument about this one. Ruth G's. Ruth and Bill G lived in Houston, Texas, old-time orchid growers, and this was named for Ruth. Bet Diane by Old Whitey, Mount Empress, Armor Cross 75, FCC AOS. Now, there are a million of these. There's Bill, and there's 505, and Dallas, and Fort Worth, and every city I know. But I always find it interesting that the ones that don't ever meet the public eye are the best ones. And this is my favorite of the lot. Gold Kist. I love the lip. It is such a perfect name for a lip like that. And the flower is so round. The petals are reflex back on this photograph. It normally isn't like that, but I just love that beautiful, beautiful lip. Look at the difference. Overlapping petals.
One of those when you got that?
What?
Were you able to get more than one when you got that? Or was just one plant of it?
That was an interesting scenario. That was Shirley Kresge when her husband died. That was one of those, you buy them all to get one thing. Then another more recent thing, this is closer to your time period. Sierra Blanca Mount Whitney, also from Armor Cross. Athena Chigaris by Norton Benes, Armor Cross 1985. Another popular plant, still widely used in cultivation. And I stop with this because this is a tribute to my friend Walter Off, who just passed away. It has not been named. This plant was, cross was made by his grandfather. And I asked him to hold off on naming it till I could help him think of somebody whose name deserved this plant. David and I are still talking about it. But this plant, Helen P. Dane by Isabel Off, this plant cross was made in 1949. And it produces huge, huge flowers, not particularly round. But there's something in the background that Bill Rogerson will see. And look at the shape of this flower. It is one of the only provable direct descendants from Schroederii Alba Hercules. And look, if you go look, it still has the shape of the flower. And look at the lip. And we're going to go back real quick because I want you to see that something you can trace all the way back to the beginning. I've found 4 plants that I can directly trace back to this plant. And Isabel is one of them. And look at the shape, and look at the lip. The genetics stayed put. A plant that's never been named since 1949. So, that's a walkthrough of white Cattleyas. A lot of you probably think of other things that you ask why I didn't include. Well, this is the speaker's choice. It's preferences and taste and the things that I love the most. And I thought it would be fun to show you some things that you've never seen before or maybe never even heard of, and show you the progression from our very first plant in the 1800s of a white species to where we are today, or close to where we are today, in Cattleya breeding. And I think over all these years, you can see the repetitive theme. Bobel's being used over and over and over. Athena Chigaris, Edith the Eye Alba being used over and over and over. They kept those same gene pools because they were so good and kept crossing and crossing and crossing and making new and wonderful things. So this is to Walt. Any questions? Uh-huh.
You always give us a lot of history, so I wonder if you could tell us more about this wonderful world of wealthy collectors and growers between the wars.
Well, the biggest period would have been before World War I. Actually, there was a small handful. They were all in the East Coast, mostly in the Massachusetts, New York area. But the most famous, I will tell you my favorite story because it's one that very few people know about, but John Lyne's daughter, Joan, has his journal. I would say there were two collections that were in this country so famous. Certainly Albert Cameron Burridge, which was the largest private collection ever established in anywhere. 19 greenhouses on railroad tracks that he moved by the season, so he could just move the whole greenhouse, you know, when it went from fall to spring or whatever. He had 32 growers. He published his book, Ken I'm sure has his book, Orchid Vale, and his whole collection of plants is in a book form by the genera. So is his library, yes. And he had houses everywhere. He made his fortune in the tin business in South America, the emerald business in South America, and also the train business in America. And he was a lawyer. And he was a lawyer, and a Quaker. He was an interesting Quaker. And he amassed this immense fortune, and his passion was orchids. So he had this estate in Massachusetts outside of Boston with these incredible greenhouses. And now let me tell you something that I find most interesting was he was an engineer not by profession, but in his mental abilities. His greenhouses, where his Odontoglossums grew, he was able to bloom them in the summertime, even in Boston where it gets warm. And he had refrigerated water in giant tanks. And he built these greenhouses where they were like lath houses, they were down in the ground, and just a little bit of glass sticks out, and then the roof at a very sharp angle. And he had sprayers of cold ice water that sprayed the whole glass all summer long, and it kept the greenhouses very cool, and he was able to grow Odontoglossums all year long and bloom them all year long. His other huge competitor beside Mr. Dane, which we've talked about, was a gentleman that Oliver Lyons, I don't know if any of y'all remember Lyons Orchids in Signal Mountain, it's still there, Tennessee, Joan's grandfather. Oliver was the grower for the Cooley collection in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Arthur Cooley was a very, very wealthy gentleman, a single gentleman who had an incredible collection of orchids. He had brought Oliver from Kew Gardens to be his head grower. And interestingly enough, this is in the New York Times, when he died in 1918, it's either 18 or 19, the Dixons from Elkins Park were the railroad magnates and extremely wealthy people, paid $250,000 in 1918 for his orchid collection. And they brought it all to their home along with the grower. They bought the collection and the grower. And I always thought that was an interesting thing. But most of these people in this country, they were emulating what was going on in Europe, because what a lot of people don't realize, all of Queen Victoria, or most of Queen Victoria's children and grandchildren, including the Tsarina of Russia, who was her granddaughter, all had incredible orchid collections. That was the thing to do. It was a court hobby. And the people who were not to the manor born or to the royal throne, also the earls and dukes and whatever. You go to Chatsworth to this very day, the Duke of Devonshire at Chatsworth, their collection, that's where Paxton, Joseph Paxton was his gardener, who wrote The Flower Garden and did so many of the early exegesis on orchids. These people in Europe were passionate about plants. So the people who had money, who were not kings and queens, were emulating the kings and queens. And when the Industrial Revolution came to this country, guess what? All the wealthy folk here wanted to be like the rest of the world. And that's what they were doing. And they wanted to be like royalty, and it was the hobby of royalty. The flower shows, long before there was an orchid show, there were flower shows. The big ones were Boston and New York. And I've told you, when they spent $50,000 to take the roof off. This is a world that we don't even have a concept of. There were no income taxes. People amassed fortunes that were beyond belief. And you come to Florida, as Ken said, and you send your workers and you dig up palm trees for your exhibit, and you take the roof off of Horticultural Hall in Boston for 8,000 square feet and have black swans swimming around, eating your neighbor's Odontoglossums. I mean, it's an amazing world. Do that, exactly. But even when I was a little boy growing up in the 50s, and certainly Bob will remember this, there were plenty of people still around. My godparents were an example. They had no children, and they had lots of money. And I remember when he built the big Lord and Burnhams, they were in his backyard 40 feet wide and 150 feet long, and dug ponds and put gasoline storage tanks for thousands of gallons of rainwater for his orchids. And I remember Alfred saying, you know, in 1950, each of those greenhouses was $100,000. Well, that was a lot of money in 1950 for a little hobby. And he certainly wasn't the only person in this country. But the glory days were certainly up till World War II, and then maybe a little bit afterwards. So many of these families, what a lot of people don't realize, if you look at the founders of the American Orchid Society in 1921 and who the original members were, they were either the people with these vast estates or the gardeners. They put their gardeners as members, but all the DuPont clan, there were quite a few of those. There were all the industrial magnates. The Guggenheims, Daniel Guggenheim has the family from New York that has the museum. They were founders of the American Orchid Society, had great collections. But it's all people of great wealth that were emulating what was going on abroad. And their passion was to collect the best of the best. They could afford the best of the best. And rarely did many of these plants ever get out of their hands. And that's the reason they could care less whether they won an award or whatever. My favorite story, and then I'll quit, because this one is sort of an interesting one. Of all the orchid stories and that have to deal with this time period and money, the most famous one is Gigas firmin-limbo or Varsovitzi Alba sumentensis. In 1911 at the Boston Flower Show, when it was shown by John Lager, and it won the Best in Show, the first white Gigas ever found. Sanders, the great English orchid house of England, had their agent waiting there. They paid $10,000 in 1911 for this plant. John Lager took the Queen Mary, in those days, himself, carried this plant, delivered it, hand-delivered it back to England. Sanders already had the buyer, Monsieur Firmin-Limbo from Belgium, the one that I told you in World War I, took his suitcase, his mother's picture, his rosary, and this plant with him out of the country, sold it for $15,000. That's the world of orchids that once was. In this country, there's a mossy eye. I think Armando and I know you still have it, I still have it. Mossy eye Reineckiana Young's variety. Famous, famous breeder. In 1928, the first division sold of that was for $10,000 to a collector in Cleveland, Ohio. It made the papers. So that's the world that was. It was collectors of rare things, and if you were a good friend and you knew them or you had something they wanted, you got it. And I'll end with my favorite story, because Bob's family and my godparents and I grew up together and in the orchid world, and I knew his mom and dad, and she used to make sure I got to church and to Mass, and she wasn't even the Catholic in the family. But there's a very famous story, and it's about the falcons. Does anybody know about falcon Westernbert and Alexanderi? They're a very famous red flower that took the world by storm because it's true cardinal red, little bitty thing. In those days, when you went to Europe, and this is during the World Orchid Congress in London, if you had to ask how much something cost, conference, yes, you couldn't afford it, and you didn't ask. But Alfred and Bob Scully Sr. flicked a coin. There were two great clones, Alexanderi and Westernbert. And the agreement was if one got Westernbert and one got Alexanderi, and then they'd grow them up, and then they'd each get a piece, trade a piece. Alfred tells the story sitting in whatever the hotel, I can't remember what it was in London. And those days there were no CITES or any of that crap, and your papers were delivered in wrapped in brown, plants in brown paper and whatever, and you were presented, hand-delivered your little bill. That was 1961. Correct? Wasn't that 61? Third WOC? 60, okay, 60. $750 a bulb. 3 bulbs and an eye. You paid full price for the eye. So multiply that times 4. The story was that Mr. Scully told Alfred, my godfather, he said, "Don't ever let anybody know. My wife would kill me." And so they're gone to orchid heaven, but I still think that's a funny story, because you didn't ask and you were expected to pay, but that's the way it was.
Jeff, what are you doing now to preserve it?
I'll tell you, people ask that. There's a wonderful person in Florida who is my new favorite person, Calvin Anderson. I don't know if y'all know Calvin. Better Blooming Orchids. I have been selfing and dry potting, because everybody's going to ask, "Are your orchid, do you have virus?" Of course I have virus. How many of these plants could you not have that are that old without virus? I've been selfing, and then we are experimenting now with what is called apical meristemming. You're lucky if you get 10 plants, maybe 20, because it was proven many, many, many years ago by Georges Morel in France that if you only take the very smallest tip of the apical meristem, it is completely virus-free. Getting them to grow is a hard thing. We've had success with 4 plants thus far, but that's 4 plants. And then my other thing that all of y'all know I've been doing for years is front bulbing. It's a disastrously nerve-wracking process, but it works. It just takes patience, and you're always afraid you're going to lose your eye. Clint McDade started this back in the 50s because it was proven that on Cattleyas, the first new growth, the quantity, if you want to use the word correctly, of virus that may be there is far less than everything back and in the roots. So you take, when the new growth is about this long, you take the very front bulb and you whack it off with that one thing, and you hope and pray that all those eyes that are on the back that you've gently...
But Jeff, you can clean virus out of plants now.
Yes, you can, chemically, but it's not economically feasible to send them to Germany now.
$10,000.
I know, it's $10,000 a plant. I've only done one. I only did one. But $10,000 for a plant adds up real quick.
I agree. But what you do is you sell the plant, pre-sell them, only do 100, there's your $10,000.
Well,
And
I've done it on one.
As you do them, your price comes down.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, I hadn't gotten to that point yet. I about fell on the floor. But
I've talked this to people blue in the face because that's the way to resurrect these things that are viral.
and dry pod selfing, you know, works. But I'll tell you this on the front bulbing, and it was proven many years ago, and it does work. You could take a Cattleya that even has Odontoglossum marine spot and color breaks. And I have one plant that it took me forever to find. Reggie Bright found it for me in some little man's collection in Tennessee, Sargon the Conqueror, that I'd been looking for. I mean, the only one I know in existence. And I have front bulbed and front bulbed and front bulbed, and I have no color break now. It still shows up on the little tabs, but the line is so small now. But there are things you can do. And but to answer your question, that's what I'm doing. And then I have an agreement with the Los Angeles County Arboretum. I send them plants. I've been depositing some certainly at Longwood. And then I have a few friends that I consider as crazy as I am. One of them's right here, that you entrust special things to, because if they're gone when there's a one-of-a-kind plant. Yes? Yes, they all go back through Bow Bells. Everything goes back through Bow Bells. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
I've got a story for you that Tony Bosch told me. Now, whether Bob can corroborate this or not, I don't know, but this was back when Jones and Scully was by the Miami River.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of brings together or justifies white Cattleyas with your swan-eaten Odontoglossums. Back in the 70s, there were a lot of...
Uh-huh.
Yeah, there were a lot of well, I mean, there were these animal import businesses along the Miami River. Every once in a while, they'd go out of business and just open the cages, which is why we had monkeys in the trees, and but we also had iguanas in the greenhouse.
Uh-huh.
And back then, we used to time the Cattleyas for the winter season, for the show season, that sort of thing. So we had great big blocks of lavender Cattleyas, great big blocks of white Cattleyas, and the iguanas would go through the greenhouses at night, and they'd eat all the lavender Cattleyas, and they wouldn't touch the white Cattleyas. So
the converse to the swans.
There is justice in the world. Is that right, Bob, or not?
That's right, and we finally mixed them up so they weren't all together.
Aha! That's even better.
Well, anyway, we also had Bruce Brasidas, who was the reptile controller at the old place too. So.
Any other questions?
You know, you had Little Angel up there several times. That is a whole line of breeding from that we even get to today. Beautiful stuff came out of that. That O'Brieniana Alba.
Oh, O'Brieniana.
Which is, they really don't know what it is.
No, they never have, and it's changed names a million times.
They try to make it, but it probably is a back cross onto a back cross or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
From the jungle, because it was found in
It was, indeed. Okay, well, that's my little history of white Cattleyas.